Thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to partake in your meeting. I wish I was there with you, so hopefully there will be an opportunity to ask and answer questions after this talk. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so on this initiative, which is quite a new initiative in Canada, but it's a very exciting initiative that's getting a lot of attention. Not many people are yet aware of key biodiversity areas, but I'm starting to get unsolicited requests for information about it. So that's, to me, a key signal that soon people will be quite aware of this in Canada. Oh, I should have mentioned on the first page there, so I've been to the Kootenays a few times. I have some friends who live there, and I used to live in Canmore. And I was looking through the Kootenay Connect report that was sent to me very kindly by Juliet, and looking at the kinds of species and ecosystems that are of interest in that area. And there is some overlap between the species that you're interested in and the different kinds of ecosystems and conservation measures and what we're doing with the key biodiversity areas approach. So there you have your grizzly bear, you have Spalding's campion, which I understand is a very important plant in the Kootenays, and you have the northern leopard frog as well. So I probably don't need to talk to you about global biodiversity decline. I'm sure everyone is well aware that across the world we're losing species and ecosystems at an ever-increasing rate. In Canada, the situation is not very different. From the WWF Canada report from a couple of years ago, and this mirrors the Environment and Climate Change Canada numbers as well. About half of monitored wildlife species in Canada declined in abundance in the last few decades. Habitat loss is a driver of this species decline. And we're also seeing that species that are really important to the economy and to different cultures are in decline. But there's also a lot of overlooked species and ecosystems that are in decline, and perhaps even showing higher levels of threat than some of the species that we're most used to seeing as poster species for biodiversity loss. So I'm thinking about lichens and invertebrates, species that don't always get a lot of conservation attention. The pie graph on the right of this slide shows some of the key biodiversity area, what we call trigger species. So these are the species that have certain levels of threat associated with them and could trigger a key biodiversity area. So we're compiling data on these kinds of species, and you'll see that a lot of them are, well, those are fungi, but they're actually mostly lichens. You have a huge number of invertebrate species, a lot of plants. These are the global trigger species for key biodiversity areas. There are national level trigger species that I'll get into in a minute as well. But there's a huge potential for drawing attention to these overlooked taxa through tools like this, which are quantitative and look at all types of biodiversity elements, all species and all ecosystems. And I don't probably have to mention either that there's not that much media coverage or attention to biodiversity decline in Canada, despite the fact that Canadians love nature and we love our wilderness and we're very proud of what we have here. So I think there's an opportunity to draw attention, even more attention, to some of the most fantastic and unique places that are unique at the global scale. So what are key biodiversity areas? The technical definition is that they are sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. And this idea of persistence, the flip side of it is risk. So we're trying to identify areas where if that site were to disappear, you would be losing a species or a unique assemblage of species or a unique ecosystem that would not be able to recover because that site is disproportionately important to the persistence of that type of species or group of species or ecosystem. So there are places in Canada, like what I was just saying, that there are places that are unique or rare at the planetary scale. But we've been talking within our initiative about how to communicate this because there are some people understand the idea of key biodiversity areas in different ways, but really this particular tool is a very specific tool and it can be used in a number of different ways, but it does not come with any conservation prescription attached to it. So if you delineate a site and call it a key biodiversity area because it qualifies using quantitative thresholds, it doesn't mean that that area is protected. The people in the area where the site is identified have a better understanding of the conservation context and can decide what the best way to either steward or conserve that area is. And it could involve protected area planning, but it could also involve a large range of other conservation measures as well. So it's an information layer, really, that will enable us to identify where these really important areas are, to make sure that they're part of our conservation efforts. So it can be used for protected area planning, and that was in fact in Canada the reason that key biodiversity areas have been funded, to feed into the Canadian effort to achieve 17% protected area coverage at the national scale. But you can also use this information to inform landscape planning, so land use planning and regional assessments, environmental impact assessments, stewardship. It can give you fodder or to be able to raise money in order to continue stewardship efforts that are already ongoing. It might be useful for communication and outreach and awareness of the kinds of biodiversity elements that are important in an area and why they're important. And it's also a very useful component of conservation targets. So the Canadian Target 1, the 17% protection of land at the federal scale, that should not necessarily just be land protected anywhere. It should ideally be protecting areas that are important and have been shown to be important for biodiversity. And there's a couple of other qualitative elements of protected area planning too that I'll mention in a second. A very important part of this idea of key biodiversity areas is that it's an internationally recognized standard, that one tool that can be applied across all different kinds of species and ecosystems. And it's been tested over the course of the last 10 years, led by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, and a lot of different partners at the global scale. And a couple of Canadians have been quite key in bringing this forward as well, and also bringing this tool to Canada and raising funds for it. And that's Justina Ray at the Wildlife Conservation Society, and Stephen Woodley, who works at IUCN now, but used to be part of Parks Canada. So the impetus for developing a tool like this, which can be used for all elements of biodiversity, was that conservation organizations at the global scale were tired of using multiple tools depending on what type of species that they were looking at. So there was a tool for identifying which areas are important for birds, another tool for butterflies, another tool for important plant areas, etc. So this is one umbrella tool, and all of those partners that developed the butterfly tool and the bird tool and the plant tool all got together and have agreed on this one tool that can incorporate all of them together. So we have an international and a national mandate. I mentioned the international one, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity's target to achieve 17% of terrestrial land protection. And they mention in that target that we should be focusing on areas that are of particular importance for biodiversity. We don't have one standardized way to do that in Canada. All the different provinces and territories have different approaches, and we don't want to replace those approaches, but we want to see whether we can fit in to the ongoing work that's happening within those different jurisdictions, and see whether this tool might be useful to them. And in fact, so far there's been quite a lot of a positive response, and we are working with a number of provinces and territories already to do work in specific places. So at the national level, the pathway to Target 1, which is Canada's plan to achieve that 17% of protection, recognizes key biodiversity areas specifically as one of the qualitative elements of that target, and along with connectivity and representativity. So this is not the one answer to everything. You want to have a protected area network or a conservation network that captures all the most important biodiversity elements, but also is nicely well connected across the landscape and represents different ecosystems as well, or ecoregions. So it's one tool and one information layer, and not to be used in isolation, clearly. So what's the opportunity in Canada and in places where you are specifically? from talking to a lot of NGOs across Canada, people recognize that there's a huge opportunity in having a single and consistent standard that's endorsed by all the major conservation groups. I'll show you who's involved in a minute. It allows for mutually supportive communications and campaigns as well. We're all making use of the same tool and communicating the same ideas, and that's a very powerful thing. And in fact, one of the most exciting things about the Key Biodiversity Area Initiative is that almost all of the big NGOs across Canada are involved, and all the other ones are invited to get involved and may get involved in the near future. There's also a lot of government buy-in. So the federal government has provided core funding for this initiative for the next couple of years. We are raising matching funds from different sources and foundations and private donors. But there's growing interest in the provincial and territorial governments as well. And we hope that the result will be more effective implementation of conservation efforts, that there'll be greater agreement on where we need to focus conservation resources. And of course, again, I always want to stress that this is one tool and it's a very useful information layer, but all sorts of other important ideas have to go into conservation planning as well. I don't have to tell you, sometimes there are more social or cultural reasons to protect areas too, even if they don't match up with some of the Key Biodiversity Area results. So this is the growing Canadian Key Biodiversity Area Coalition. The major partners that are doing a lot of work right now are Bird Studies Canada, because they have a whole set of important bird and biodiversity areas across Canada. There are hundreds of them. All of those important bird areas, the IBAs, will be grandfathered into the Key Biodiversity Area program, but they all have to be reassessed under the new Key Biodiversity Area thresholds and criteria. WWF Canada has been highly involved, as well as Nature Conservancy of Canada, and then a number of other organizations have slowly been coming in and doing regional work, if not work at the national scale. So the criteria, I think it's important to at least mention what's captured by the Key Biodiversity Area Standard. It's not just about species at risk. It's also capturing all sorts of important sites for biodiversity that aren't just the at-risk elements. So criterion A, which is at the top left, that's the species at risk, but also ecosystems at risk. So there are a number of threatened ecosystems in Canada that are also captured by this. Criterion B captures species that are only found in very constricted places, like Spalding's campion actually is a good example of one. So it's not widely distributed. One or two sites are disproportionately important for conservation. We don't want to lose these species, so we need to identify them. And there's a lot of plants and invertebrates like that across Canada who are just existing in one small area, and we need to know where that area is. Criterion C is about ecological integrity. And this is a very important criterion in Canada, because we are one of the only countries left in the world with huge expanses of intact landscapes. Sometimes they're less intact than people imagine, for example, in the boreal forest, but we need to identify some of these huge intact sites, and this criterion provides a very specific set of guidelines for how you identify sites that are at least 10,000 square kilometers large, and have to have the least amount of human impact and the highest amount of biotic integrity defined in very specific ways, to make sure that some of these large remaining areas are kept wild. And that doesn't mean that they can't have humans living in them, but often it means that there can be no industrial impacts in these areas. Criterion D is for biological processes. So these are sites that are really important for migrating birds, for example, or they are areas that are important for feeding at certain times of the year, or for hibernation. For example, a very large bat hibernaculum might qualify under criterion D. And then criterion E is more of a quantitative approach to identifying sites that are irreplaceable under a number of different criteria. The last little thing on the bottom right is just to note that there are a lot of guidelines and instructions for how you apply the Key Biodiversity Area Standard. But Canada, even though those have been developed over the past 10 years, Canada is one of the first countries actually implementing the idea and the concept at a national scale And we are already finding that we're having to rewrite some of the guidelines, and we will be contributing to the effort at the global scale through the experiences that we're gaining here in Canada in different jurisdictions, because it looks very different in different places across Canada. And just diving a little bit into the details, but only for a second, this is an example of a criterion, criterion A1 on threatened species, and just to show what it takes to be a key to qualify as a key biodiversity area. If, say, for example, you have a species that is listed on the IUCN Red List as critically endangered, or well, Spalding's campion in the right-hand corner there is actually listed by NatureServe as G2, which is globally threatened at the level G2. So then you would need 0.5% of the global population size within a site for that site to qualify as a key biodiversity area. So that's what I mean by a quantitative threshold, that it's not someone's opinion that this is an important site, but this is a robustly quantified site that shows that this particular area is important at the global scale for the persistence of a particular species or a set of species. Often some of these sites will have multiple species that are important. So I won't go into more of the details there. And so one of the things that we're interested in is having partners who can do the work on the ground of identifying these sites. If there's really good data for a species, for example, again, coming back to Spalding's campion, you can go out and see whether that site or a particular site qualifies as a key biodiversity area by testing to see what proportion of the global population exists in that site. And you either use population numbers, or you say what percentage of the species global range is found in this site. But we want to do this in a way that that works in partnership with the people living in places and already working on conservation. So this could be a desktop analysis, and in fact we are proceeding a little bit on the side with some larger scale analyses to see where key biodiversity areas are. But in reality, if we're identifying and delineating a site, it has to be done site by site with the people who are already working in those areas, if there are people working in those areas, and also in collaboration with any First Nations or other Indigenous groups that are living in that area, or other communities as well. So you need to start by identifying some promising sites. Many of those are known because there's a lot of expertise in Canada about where important sites are for species that are not found anywhere else. So we already have a good idea just from talking to experts about where some of these sites are. Or you can start from what I called before these trigger species. That these are species that are under threat, or that we know only exist in a small area of Canada. And you can say, well, where have they been observed? And see if you can find a site based on some of those observations. And then you need to consult with regional experts, figuring out which of the different kinds of species that you have on your list are important for conservation in a particular area, where you might want to start your work, whether there's enough data to be able to identify the key biodiversity area. You want to develop awareness of the tool with other stakeholders and with government, not just with the conservation experts. And then you need to decide on an assessment process of actually testing out the thresholds and filling in the forms and interacting with different actors and stakeholders as well. You need to do that that actual technical work, and then bring it back to other stakeholders who might not have been involved in the technical work, to make sure that no one's being taken by surprise by the identification of sites in their territory. So I've just put this slide here, not to get into it in any detail, but just to say that work actually takes a lot of time, as probably all of you know, because you work in a place where you need to consult with your neighbors and figure out who wins and who loses when different kinds of conservation approaches are enacted. So we will be doing site by site, but there are potentially thousands of key biodiversity areas in Canada. We have already hundreds identified just for birds, and there will be hundreds more at the global scale. And each one takes a long time. So we are ramping up and we're starting to identify sites, but at the same time, in order to have a baseline, we have a postdoctoral fellow at McGill University who is helping with sort of this development of a database, which is gathering data from everywhere. So we have 2 full-time employees at NatureServe Canada who've been employed for the Key Biodiversity Area program, and they are scraping data from all the different conservation data centers, including data that hasn't been actually uploaded into the conservation data centers. They're scraping data from other databases such as GBIF. They're taking data from iNaturalist, so citizen science, and putting it all together in what will eventually be a universally accessible database. Some data may not allow us to share it, but as much as possible, we want to do this for for beyond the Key Biodiversity Area project. So where are we at with the initiative? We have a management committee that is composed of some of the organizations that I mentioned before. We have a broader coalition that has even more organizations on it, and I would like you're all welcome to join. Basically, it's an open community. The community itself is people who just want to be informed of the process. We have a website, which I invite you to visit. We have recommendations for making sure that the global standard is appropriate at the national level, that we're not missing any of the national and subnational conservation priorities. So, and then we're working on Indigenous engagement as well. We have a work plan for the next 2 years, and then we need to develop plans for sustainability in the longer term as well, because the Key Biodiversity Area concept is going to be incorporated into international conventions and targets. So we need to be ready to make sure that we can continue this work into the future. We have all sorts of the databases under construction. We have teams in place for collecting all that data, for scraping it from every corner of the world, and talking to experts and talking to museums. We're analyzing it and doing some of the scoping work. We're doing a lot of outreach and training because we started off last January in Sirius with full-time staff. This is a pretty new initiative, and we need to build that awareness before it can be a useful tool. And finally, there's a number of regional initiatives underway because we're finding that it makes more sense to do things within regions than from some centralized location. By 2020, we hope to have significant additions to our Key Biodiversity Area network in Canada. Those will also be shown on the global Key Biodiversity Area database as well, but we'll have our own Canadian Key Biodiversity Area database that will be searchable, and that information will be available to everyone. We'll have better understanding and documentation of Canada's biodiversity. This is really exciting to me that we're developing range maps, for example, for almost all of the Key Biodiversity Area species that we're looking at. Because we're finding that we have actually very poor data for a lot of things, but we have some observations, and NatureServe Canada has hired these full-time people to develop range maps to show exactly where these species have been observed and where they're likely to be, and those will all be reviewed by experts across Canada as well, and then we'll have this open database as well eventually. We hope to have lots more people involved in the KBA coalition, and we hope that most people will then have heard of Key Biodiversity Areas. As I said before, we're not starting from zero. We have 525 Key Biodiversity Areas already identified, and those are the important bird areas. The Bird Studies Canada is our partner, and they have agreed to sort of try to figure out how to put those concepts together. We don't want to get rid of important bird areas because there's been a lot of effort over decades now for people stewarding these sites, and you can't just go in and say that's no longer an important bird area. It still is, but maybe it'll be co-branded, for example. These are some of the regional and thematic initiatives that we're undertaking. I think I only have a couple more slides. So in Yukon, there's a coordinator, and we're working with the government and First Nations and a number of taxonomic experts to identify sites up there, and there'll be a workshop in early November to delineate a number of sites and make sure that we have the right data. In British Columbia, we're working with the provincial government above all, but then also there's a number of other partners coming in, and they've actually identified the first new Key Biodiversity Area. I'll show you a map of it in a second. In Quebec, we're working with a number of academic partners as well as with the government. In Atlantic Canada, it's the Nova Scotia government. So this is, I'm just sort of showing this to say that it looks different in different places. We're being a bit opportunistic and very open in terms of who can come in. In the end, anyone can identify a key biodiversity area. We're willing to support and provide analysis and analytics support to anyone who wants to do that, and training as well. Because it doesn't really matter who identifies them, it either quantitatively qualifies as a key biodiversity or not, and it will be reviewed and submitted through the national initiative. So this is the new site in British Columbia. It's Trial Islands, which is just south of Victoria, and it qualified as a key biodiversity area. They originally thought it was for 3 plants that only grow in that place, but it turns out that some of them have populations that are in the States that are quite large actually, so that didn't quite meet the quantitative thresholds. But for Victoria's paintbrush, it does. So it does qualify as a globally important key biodiversity area. So that's exciting. They're very excited about it. And so there's tons more to be done. And I think even just looking at some of the maps of how the species are distributed across even the Kootenays, there's a number of sites that are just waiting to be identified and delineated to support all of your conservation initiatives there. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions about this.
Thank you, Ciara. I'm just going to come away from the computer and see if you can hear this microphone. Can you hear it?
I can, yes.
Okay, do we have other questions for Ciara? I think you probably have to speak into the mic.
You talked about some fairly large areas. Is there a minimum size for designated area?
There isn't. So the idea is that there's no minimum or maximum size. The only size idea that has been put forward was for that criterion C, the large ecologically intact areas. But for other sites, they suggest that sites should be manageable, of a manageable size. But that's different in different countries, and Canada is not the prototypical country for which this type of tool was developed. So we are exploring what makes sense and what manageable means. And I think it will be different in different kinds of landscapes as well. So yeah, so you can have tiny sites. We've found some sites in Newfoundland for these 2 Brea plant species where the sites could easily be a couple of square kilometers or even just 1 square kilometer or less. But they shouldn't be too small because, well, they do need to capture a certain proportion of the global population, and they also need to have some robustness to change, including climate change.
I just wondered what the, like, iNaturalist that collects data all over the country, what kind of impact does that make for the district? You know, the plant identification site iNaturalist?
Sorry, it's quite muffled to the microphone, so I can hear that you're talking about iNaturalist, but I'm not quite sure what the question was.
I just wondered what kind of impact that has, like with just a diverse number of people adding information to iNaturalist, what do you do with that analysis? Or does it get put into your system?
I'm sorry, I really just can't hear the question at all. Is there, I'm not sure what to suggest.
Yeah, she's just wondering about the impact of iNaturalist, if you collect those data and if they go into your system.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so that microphone here works better. Yes, so iNaturalist is becoming the way that almost all of the conservation data centers collects data, in fact. So there's very little funding for field surveys that are government run. And so I was talking to someone in the Ontario, the Natural Heritage Information Center, and they were saying that something like 60 or 70% of their data now comes from iNaturalist. And most of that is for very common species, but it's an incredible trove. So I think that, and not only that, but they're wrestling with this idea of data being open And different provinces have different ideas about whether data should be shared, but it's becoming more difficult to say that data should be private and should not be shared with the public if all the data is coming from the public. So this is actually a good thing, and it's the whole nature of, you know, where data is coming from and observations are coming from is changing. So it's there's a huge opportunity, and we're taking all of that data. In fact, we already have all the iNaturalist data for all of the species of interest to the Key Biodiversity Area program. And our database will be dynamic in that it will continue to upload new observations on a regular basis so that our database is always up to date. And we hope that that will allow us to create really precise range maps, so good knowledge of exactly where those species are found and areas where they're concentrated in order to be able to identify particular sites that are important for conservation.
Thanks, Ciara. I think we'll have to end it there, but we really do appreciate you taking the time to speak with us and to going through our computer logistics this morning. And we look forward to being in touch with you and finding out if there are any KBAs proposed for the Kootenays or any way our partnership can help with that.
Please do. And if anyone is interested in being in touch, feel free to share my email address. I'm very interested in continuing any discussions that people are interested in.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.